When the stars judge the past, the alien thought experiment and the power struggle over ancient Egypt's identity. Imagine this. An intelligent alien vessel touches down on Earth for the first time. It lands in Egypt. The cities are empty. Not a single human in sight. Wandering the Nile Valley, the alien enters the tombs, studies the wall paintings, examines the sculptures and scans the mummified remains. No human has yet told this alien what to think. No textbook has preloaded bias into its mind. With only the visual evidence before it, brown and reddish-brown skin tones, tightly curled hair, broad noses and African cultural aesthetics, the alien would likely conclude the builders of these pyramids and temples were African people. The alien would simply be recording what it sees, unbiased by centuries of colonial distortion. And that is precisely the problem. On Earth, the identity of ancient Egypt is not treated as a question of evidence, but of power. Why this matters: for over 2 centuries, powerful governments, universities, museums, and media industries have told a different story, one that subtly or outright removes ancient Egypt from Africa. Egypt is often described as Mediterranean, Near Eastern, or Middle Eastern, anything but part of the Black African world. If the truth of Egypt's African origins were globally and officially recognized, it would not simply change the way history is taught. It would trigger a cascade of political, financial, and cultural consequences that would upend some of the most influential institutions in the modern world. The institutions that stand to lose the most: British Museum, UK; the Louvre, France; Noes Museum, Germany, home of the Nefertiti bust; Metropolitan Museum of Art, USA; Egyptian Museum, Cairo. These museums have long placed Egypt alongside Greece and Rome rather than in Africa's historical continuum. Recognizing Egypt as an African civilization would force them to rewrite gallery narratives, physically reorganize collections, and admit that classification systems were shaped by racial bias. It would also strengthen calls for repatriation of artifacts not just to Egypt, but also to Sudan and other African nations tied to the Nile Valley heritage. Western Academic Egyptology, University of Oxford; Griffith Institute, University of Cambridge; Department of Archaeology, University of Chicago; Oriental Institute, Harvard University; Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations, Sorbonne University, France. Modern Egyptology emerged in the colonial era and often framed Egypt as culturally separate from Black Africa. Entire careers, PhD theses and academic reputations rest on this framing. Officially recognizing Egypt's African identity would not only demand rewriting curricula, it would also undermine decades of peer-reviewed work and the credibility of those who authored it. Global education systems: US K-12 World History Curricula, UK National Curriculum, Key Stage 2, French, German, Italian history programs. Egypt is often taught as part of the ancient world alongside Mesopotamia and Greece, not as part of African history. Recognizing its African roots would require textbooks to be rewritten, teachers to be retrained, and standardized testing frameworks to be altered, a costly and politically sensitive process. Religious institutions: the Vatican Catholic tradition, Evangelical Biblical Archaeology institutions, US, Jewish historical organizations, claims about Israelite presence in Egypt, Islamic historical scholarship, Arab conquest narratives. Egypt plays a central role in biblical and Quranic history. Recentering it as a Black African civilization would challenge traditional depictions of biblical figures and reframe theological narratives, a shift that could cause friction across multiple faith traditions. The entertainment industry: Hollywood studios, Warner Bros., Disney, Universal, etc., streaming platforms, Netflix, Amazon Prime, Apple TV. The entertainment world has profited from depicting ancient Egypt as white or racially ambiguous. Accurate African representation would force casting changes, historical consulting, and cultural accountability in a way that Hollywood has resisted for decades. The colonial separation of Egypt from Africa was deliberate. It maintained a racial hierarchy that placed African civilizations as less advanced. Reversing this would reignite debates over historical injustices, reparations, and stolen heritage. Egypt itself would face new political pressures to openly embrace its African identity. Tourism and cultural branding: Egypt's tourism marketing has often leaned into Arab and Mediterranean imagery. Acknowledging African roots might alienate certain Western markets, while opening doors to a deeper cultural connection with African audiences. This rebranding would require not just brochures, but a new national identity narrative. The real reason for resistance. The evidence for ancient Egypt's African identity is clear in art, archaeology, linguistics, and genetics. The resistance to acknowledging it comes not from lack of proof, but from the cost of truth. Loss of control over history for Western museums, loss of academic credibility for generations of Egyptologists, loss of political narratives built on separating Africa from one of its greatest civilizations. In short, recognizing Egypt as African is not just a historical correction, it is a redistribution of cultural power. If our hypothetical alien were called to a cosmic court to judge humanity's truthfulness, it might look over the tomb paintings, examine the mummies, and read the historical record. Then it might glance at modern textbooks and museum placards, raise a brow, and ask, "Why did you change the faces of the builders?" That is the uncomfortable question the world has been avoiding. And when the answer finally comes, it won't just rewrite history, it will rewrite the balance of who gets to tell it. The long war over ancient Egypt's identity, how Africa was written out of its own history. For over 2 centuries, the question of who built ancient Egypt has been one of history's most fiercely contested battles. Not because the evidence is missing, but because the answer disrupts power. The debate is not purely academic. It has been a political, cultural, and racial battlefield where empires, universities, museums, and media have all taken sides. At the heart of it lies a simple truth. Ancient Egypt was an African civilization, founded and built by an indigenous Nile Valley people. But for much of the last 200 years, a powerful global network has worked to reframe it as the work of a non-African race. Mediterranean, Arab, even European in origin. This rebranding was not accidental. It was deliberate, sustained, and deeply tied to colonial and racial agendas. The ancient world acknowledging the obvious. In antiquity, there was little confusion about who the Egyptians were. Greek historian Herodotus famously described them as having black skin and woolly hair. Other writers of the Greco-Roman world often distinguished Egyptians from Greeks and Romans on physical and cultural grounds. But as empires rose and fell, narratives shifted. By the time the Arab conquest arrived in the 7th century CE, Egypt's ancient language was extinct, and its identity was reshaped by Islamic and Arab cultural influences. References to Egyptians as black persisted, but over time, Egypt was folded into the Arab world's story. Napoleon's scholars and the birth of modern Egyptology. When Napoleon invaded Egypt in 1798, he brought with him a team of scholars who documented every ruin, statue, and tomb they could find. Their monumental description de l'Egypte became the foundation of modern Egyptology. But this science was born inside European colonialism. The French, and later the British, saw Egypt as a jewel of the cradle of Western civilization, not as an African nation. For European powers justifying the conquest of Africa, it was politically inconvenient to admit that black Africans had created one of the most advanced civilizations in human history. The 19th century, race science rewrites the story. The 1800s saw the rise of scientific racism. Figures like Johann Friedrich Blumenbach and Samuel George Morton measured skulls and developed racial hierarchies that placed Caucasians at the top and Negroids at the bottom. When mummy skulls didn't fit their theories, the data was ignored. James Henry Breasted of the University of Chicago's Oriental Institute went further, placing Egypt in the Fertile Crescent and emphasizing its supposed links to Asia and Europe, while physically and culturally detaching it from Africa. Museums in London, Paris, and Berlin quietly reinforced the narrative by placing Egyptian artifacts in Near Eastern wings instead of African history sections, a subtle but powerful act of reclassification. Colonial politics and the whitewashing of Egypt. When Britain occupied Egypt in 1882, they promoted a racial divide between lighter-skinned northern Egyptians and darker-skinned southern Nubians. This served their rule in Sudan and their colonial ideology that black Africa was incapable of high civilization. Meanwhile, French Egyptologists and museum curators in Paris emphasized European facial reconstructions of pharaohs, creating imagery that aligned with European self-image. By the early 1900s, the world's textbooks, written in colonial capitals, were teaching children that Egypt was Mediterranean and that Africa's history began with European contact. Hollywood and the cultural cement. In the 20th century, film became the most powerful reinforcer of the whitewashed Egypt. From the Ten Commandments, 1956, to Cleopatra, 1963, pharaohs and queens were played by white actors. These images burned themselves into global popular culture, making it harder for the public to imagine any other reality. Even respected institutions like UNESCO and National Geographic often treated Egypt as part of the Middle East rather than Africa. School curricula placed ancient Egypt in ancient Near East chapters, divorcing it from the African civilizations of Kush, Aksum, and Mali. Resistance and African scholarship. The 1974 UNESCO Symposium in Cairo became a flashpoint, with African historians confronting Western Egyptologists directly. Yet the pushback from Western academia was fierce, often claiming that art could not be used to determine race, an argument rarely applied when depicting European antiquity. For the 21st century, DNA, media, and a continuing battle. Recent genetic studies have added fuel to the debate, though many rely on mummies from the late periods when Egypt was heavily influenced by foreign rule. This selective sampling often skews the narrative toward non-African origins. Hollywood still struggles with representation. Exodus, Gods and Kings, 2014, cast almost entirely white actors, and major museums continue to avoid stating directly that ancient Egypt was African. The reluctance is not about lack of evidence. It's about the institutional cost of reversing 2 centuries of false narratives. Who benefits from the myth? The Egypt is not African narrative has protected several powerful interests. Colonial legacy institutions that justified imperialism. Western museums whose collections were built on looting. Middle Eastern political identity movements that prefer Egypt framed as Arab Mediterranean. Global media that has invested heavily in the whitewashed imagery. What happens if the truth wins? If the world officially recognizes ancient Egypt as an African civilization, museums will face demands to rewrite exhibits, return artifacts, and acknowledge historical theft. Textbooks worldwide will require rewriting, altering how billions of people view Africa's role in world history. Political narratives in the Middle East and Europe will have to adapt, potentially disrupting cultural tourism marketing. Academic departments built on Eurocentric frameworks of history will need ideological overhaul. Media industries will be forced to reimagine portrayals of the ancient world. The fight over Egypt's identity is not just about the past, it's about who controls the story of human civilization. The monuments of Giza, the tombs of Thebes, and the temples of Luxor are not just relics. They are battlegrounds in an ongoing war over memory and meaning. If an alien landed in Egypt for the first time and saw the tomb paintings without the filter of 200 years of propaganda, they would likely credit the builders to an African people. The fact that humans still argue about it tells us less about the ancient Egyptians and more about the insecurities of the modern world.